Subhanallah, hamdan lillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar, subhanallah, hamdan lillah, wa la ilaha illallah.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. We continue in this episode looking at that famous hadith on the shade of the throne. In the previous episode, we looked at the first category, the just ruler, Imamun Adil. We said that all of the categories were linked based on the love and fear of Allah. Because what is it that makes a ruler just? There is no other authority to keep him in check. He can do what he wishes. So what stops him then from oppressing others, from taking the rights of others, from exploiting his subjects? It has to be the fear of Allah. Because looking at all of the rulers in the world today, even those who gave great pretense at being fair, when you look into their lives in reality, what you find is that they exploited their people. They took for themselves and those close to them more than really was their right. But the just Imam, this is a category which Prophet Muhammad ﷺ left as an example. He was the just Imam. And those who came after him showed the same justice. So much so that Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph, on one occasion when the people saw him giving some speech to them, and he was wearing two garments when only one garment had come to the town and it had been divided amongst people, everybody getting one, but they saw him wearing two. So they questioned, how is it you're wearing two when everybody else has one? Well, he said, the other one was my son's. And he was a big person, a single garment was not enough for me to cover myself properly. So I took my son's. But this was Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph of Islam. Had he wished to put on himself the best of clothes and live in luxury, etc., he could have. But that wasn't the way of Prophet Muhammad. May God's peace and blessing be upon him. In spite of the fact that he was the ruler of Arabia, the whole of Arabia, and all the wealth of the land was in his hands, he slept on the floor. He sewed patches into his own clothes. His bed was the leaves, the palm leaves from the palm tree, just covered by a thin layer of leather, which did not prevent the palm leaves from pushing through the leather and leaving marks on his side. That was the Prophet. May God's peace and blessings be upon him. Example of the just ruler. Abu Bakr was the same, the first caliph, and Umar ibn al-Khattab was the same, the second caliph. The second category is that of the youth, the young man who grows up worshiping Allah. And as we pointed out earlier, though a young man is mentioned here, it means a young man or young woman who grows up worshiping Allah. And as I mentioned earlier, all of the categories can be looked at in the same light. However, in the case of the just ruler, it is special for the male because from the perspective of Islam, the ultimate ruler of the country should be a male. A woman may head a company or a school or whatever, But the ultimate authority of the land should be in the hand of a male. And the Prophet, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, had said that a nation which takes as its ruler a female will fall into ruin. That category of the young person, male or female, who grows up worshiping Allah. What is so special about that? Reality is that most people who grow up in religious homes, in their youth, they're irreligious. They'll be out playing, enjoying, etc. Young people, it's the nature to think, well, I'll be good when I get older. I'll become religious when I get older. Right now I just want to have fun. That's the norm. That is how young people tend to be. And with all of the hormones and the psychological changes that they're going through in their teens, etc., desire to exert one's own self, to bolster one's self-esteem. There's a period of rebellion. You rebel against parents. You want to do your own thing, etc., etc. This is the nature of youth. So where one amongst them, male or female, chooses to toe the line, to obey the commandments of God and worship Him beyond the early age. Of course, when children are very small, it's easier for parents to control them and make them do what they want to do, so they may worship God as little kids. But then as soon as they hit the teens, this is when they start to go, from 10 onwards. But one who has such a consciousness that he or she remains on the straight path, growing up through their teenage years into their adult years, righteous, obeying God in their lives. They are rare individuals, and as such, Allah has put them in this special category of those who will be shaded by Allah's throne on the day when there will be no shade. And we said that there was a link between each of these categories. The ruler who rules in a just way, justice prevails in the land, in the realm, then that will encourage young people to grow up worshiping Allah. Because if the ruler himself is worshiping Allah, is righteous and just, then young people will see that example and it will be much easier for them to follow. But when they look into the society and they see injustice from the top to the bottom, then they are discouraged from wanting to be on the right path, from wanting to hold on to what is good and what is true and following God's commandments throughout their lives. Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, had said, the 2 feet of Adam's descendants won't move on the day of resurrection when they stand before Allah until they're asked about 5 things: his age and how he spent it, the full lifespan, how was that life spent, his youth, when he was young, and how he used that period, his wealth which Allah gave him, how he earned it, was it halal, was it haram, and how he spent it, did he spend it in halal or haram, and what he did with the knowledge which Allah gave him. So one of those questions there was his youth and how he used it. So each and every person will be questioned about their youth, as they will be questioned about whatever they were in authority over. The Imam Adil, we said, goes beyond just being the just ruler. It goes to everyone who is in a position of authority, how they apply their authority. Are they ruling according to justice, principles of justice, or are they ruling according to their own personal desires? Everyone will be asked. Similarly, everyone will be asked about their youth. So we said for both males or females, each will be asked about how they use their youth. The youth who grew up worshiping Allah, towing the line, they will be in a special position before Allah on the Day of Judgment. What we're talking about here in the hadith, though the hadith talks about those who have special blessings, really they're talking about righteous deeds in general. As Ibn Abdul Barr, one of the great scholars of the past, said, this is the best and most comprehensive hadith narrated on meritorious deeds and those who do them, inshallah. It is sufficient for you as an honor. This hadith describes righteous deeds, justice. The just Imam is talking about justice, that it is something required of each and every individual in all areas of their life. The just Imam represents the ultimate, the religious youth, one who grows up worshiping Allah, that addresses what? It's speaking about worship. To worship Allah whenever, however one can. Not to allow any opportunities to escape an individual. Because the whole of one's life as a Muslim, as a believer, should be engaged in worship. As Allah said, فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَبْ. So whenever you finish one form of worship, then transfer to another form and turn to your Lord. The motto of the believer is إِنَّ الصَّلَاةِ وَالنُّسُكِ وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Indeed, my prayers, my sacrifices, my living and my dying are for Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. My living and my dying, my life, the whole of my life should be for Allah. That's basic. So when we talk about a young person growing up worshiping Allah, what we're talking about is dedication of life to God. That one lives a life which is pleasing to God at all stages, from youth to the late years of one's life, to the point where you die in that state. We don't leave righteousness to a later point. It's a common error among people to leave righteousness beyond one's youth. But the reality is, as the Prophet ﷺ has said, people are often tricked in this manner. They're tricked by Satan. They're deceived about reality. And he said, particularly in two areas people are deceived. He said, نِعْمَتَانِ مَغْبُونٌ فِيهِمَا كَثِيرٌ مِنَ النَّاسِ. There are two blessings in which most people are deceived. الصحة والفراغ. Good health and spare time, free time. People are deceived. We think we're always going to have good health. In the youth, when one is able to worship, people neglect worship until the older age, when it becomes much more difficult to worship, things they would like to do, they can't do now because they're too old. Or there is spare time. When one thinks one has spare time, you're using it for this, using it for that, just enjoying whatever. But then when what is required of you comes, you have no more spare time. There's no time to do it. Time's gone. It's finished. So we get deceived and fooled by it. So you'll find people, for example, discouraging young people, families, elders, discouraging young people from making Hajj early in life. When they have the means, they're old enough actually to go and do it. They have the means to do it. They should be encouraged to do it. But instead people will say to them, no, don't do it now. You're still young, still committing many sins. And you know, Hajj erases sins, brings you back from the Hajj, if you do it properly, like a child who was newly born. So they say, wait until you're older. When you run out of steam, you can't commit any more sins. This is the time to go and make Hajj, you know. But this is pitiful, because a person who delays Hajj in this way, in other words, they continue to do and lead a sinful life. Such a person, when they get older, they will not be able to stop themselves. They'll end up going on the Hajj and committing sins. And they will ruin their own Hajj. And it will not be pleasing to Allah, and it will not purify them. That is the reality. So we are advised, when the Prophet ﷺ spoke about the youth who grew up worshiping Allah, we're advised as people to utilize whatever time Allah has given us. If we're young people, we don't get deceived by our youth and by what people around us say and what people around us do. We try to worship Allah as much and as best as we can in our youth. And as older people who may still retain certain aspects of youth, it's the same thing. Don't put off until tomorrow what you should be doing today. We need to apply ourselves daily. We take every day at a time. Try to do the maximum good that we can, because we don't know. None of us knows how much time we have. This world can end for us at any time. So the second category is the young person who grows up worshiping Allah. He has grown up in a society in which the Imam has laid the foundation of justice, which would breed such an individual. The third category is the man whose heart is attached to the mosques. Again, we said man or woman, like the young person, man or woman, growing up worshiping Allah. It's the man or woman whose heart is attached to the mosques. For the woman, of course, going to the mosque is not an obligation as it is for the man. But we can say within her home, there's a place of prayer. There's a place that should be designated for prayer within her home. And she should be attached to it. When the time for prayer comes, she goes and prays. And she should feel a desire to want to go and pray, whenever she has the opportunity, during the day or during the night. So this idea, this concept of attachment to the mosques is not restricted only to men. Of course, in the case of the man, it is the masjid itself. To feel a loss when the man leaves the masjid, feel a loss, like he would like to be back there. When he comes to the mosque, he finds tranquility there. He's drawn to the masjid. When the time for prayer comes, he feels that need to go there. He finds a relationship, a sense of consciousness of God there in the mosque. So he tries to spend as much time as he can, within reason, in the masjid. And the Prophet ﷺ, warning about a time to come, had said in an authentic narration, من أشراط الساعة أن يمر الرجل في المسجد لا يصلي فيه ركعتين. Among the signs of the hour will be when a man will pass through the mosque without praying 2 units of prayer. وأن لا يسلم الرجل إلا على من يعرف. And also that a man would only give greetings of peace, salam alaikum, to those who he knows. In Islam, you give the greeting of peace to everybody. You don't just limit it to those who you know. So these are among the signs of the last day. Also, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had said, whoever prays for the sake of Allah 40 days in jama'ah, that is in congregation, in which he catches the first takbir, freedom or protection from the hellfire will be written for him, as well as from hypocrisy. So establishing that prayer in jama'ah for 40 days, being on time, being right at the beginning of its time, it's protection and a promise from Allah there of protection from the fire as well as protection from hypocrisy. The other point to note with regards to hearts being linked to the mosque is that the man will go there even in the most difficult of times. Not that he only goes there when it's comfortable and easy and he has a need, but he goes there even when the place may be far, the road may be rough, he may have comfort in his home that he doesn't necessarily find there. Comfort in the sense of wanting to sleep, he can go and lie down and sleep, where in the masjid, he may not be able to do that. So he goes there, even in the most difficult of times. Attached to the masjid also means that he tries to catch the beginning of prayers, the prayer times. Whenever the prayer times come in, he tries to be there. He doesn't just go at the last minute, usually missing the first unit of prayer or the second, etc. And that should be based on the statement of the Prophet Muhammad in which he said, أَحَبُّ الْأَعْمَالِ إِلَى اللَّهِ الصَّلَاةُ فِي أَوَّلِ وَقْتِهَا. That the most beloved of deeds in the sight of Allah is prayer at the beginning of its time. And he also tries to catch the first takbir when the Imam says Allahu Akbar and the prayer starts. He tries to catch that because that will put him in the first lines of the prayer, which is the most favored lines. And he also, when he finishes his prayers, spends time remembering Allah. He doesn't just finish the prayer and runs out of the masjid, as soon as the prayer is over. He spends some time there remembering Allah. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ had spoken about a person who, after the morning prayer, stays in the masjid remembering Allah, reading Quran or whatever, until sunrise. A person who does that, gets the reward. So spending additional time in the masjid is also recommended. And among the points is that he trains his children to go regularly to the masjid. That love for the masjid should be handed down to the next generation. If his parents have trained him in that way, the likelihood is that he will be raised in that way. So similarly, he should train his children, even if he wasn't raised that way, train them in liking to be with him in the masjid. And the young children usually want to go out with their parents, want to go out with their fathers to the masjid. Some mosques discourage young children from being there. However, in the time of Prophet Muhammad, the young came to the masjids. We know Prophet Muhammad led prayer, and Hassan and Hussein, his grandchildren, would be there with him. Sometimes they would even climb on his back, whilst he was in prostration, and he would pick them up as he stood up, etc. So we know that it was the practice to bring young people to the masjid. This is to encourage that love, that attachment to the masjid throughout their lives. So wrapping this one up, we come back to the beginning again. We're talking about those people in that special position on the day of resurrection. When the sun will be close, people will be frying in the heat and scared. There will be shade only from Allah's throne. Among those who would receive that shade, would have access to the shade, would be the righteous imam, the righteous ruler and leader. Second, the young person who grows up worshiping Allah. And thirdly, the man or woman who is attached to prayer. Man attached to the masjid, to the mosque, going there regularly, going there at the beginning of the times for prayer, joining the prayers there, and joining that in his family. And the woman who at home goes to her designated area of prayer, her musalla, prays there regularly, and has a desire, her heart feels attached to that area of prayer. With that, we close our episode. Thanking you for being with us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.